Cool. So I'm going to try to get out of the way as quickly as possible and let Pratyusha do most of the talking here. But I want to start with an exercise that we sometimes do in the intro natural language processing class at MIT, which is the following. Imagine that we're sort of sitting here on Earth and one day we intercept some kind of alien broadcast. And we, are able to at least read off like the following sequence of discrete characters from this broadcast. How might we go about understanding what it is that is being communicated here? And if we have all of this, maybe there's a little bit of structural analysis we can do on the language, but maybe not all that much. Maybe we're really lucky and we also have a little bit of metadata attached to these things, sort of images that go along with these things, tentacle ratings, maybe the aliens are browsing alien Amazon and trying to figure out what's going on here. But the question is, if we have, especially, or even just this kind of grounded data, how might we actually understand what the structure is in this communication system? And sort of fundamentally, even if we have relatively rich data like this, finding structure in that data is really hard, right? We don't even know what the sort of basic units of this language might be, how those pieces get put together to form larger meanings, if the meanings relate in any way to the metadata that we have access to. And this problem is especially difficult if all we have is like a big fixed data set on which we can't actually ask questions about new utterances or sort of get labels for new images. And it's worth noting, right, that this is sort of a fundamentally different language understanding problem that people face either when they're learning their first language or when we're sort of going out and trying to document a language that we don't speak before, precisely because we don't have access to this kind of interactivity. So suppose now that we're still hanging out on Earth and the aliens fly by again and they drop off some kind of black box here. We don't know what's inside the black box, but what we do know is that we can put some strings into the black box in this alien language, and we get some things that come out of the black box that look a lot like the same distribution of data that we saw in the original alien signal. Well, once again, we don't actually understand the structure of this language. Maybe we don't exactly understand what the relationship between this black box is and the actual language that the aliens speak, beyond the fact that the sort of distribution of outputs that we get given inputs looks approximately the same. Maybe this is a multimodal black box, right? We can also put text in and we can get images out, or vice versa. And what I want to claim is that even if we don't exactly know what the correspondence is between this black box and the alien language, even if we don't have the ability to open it up, this gives us a lot more power to understand what's going on inside this language, right? We can sort of plug in strings that we've never seen before. If we have very specific hypotheses we want to test that involve very, very simple sentences, maybe simpler than sort of naturally occur with any frequency in the alien language, we can ask questions about those sentences specifically. In this sort of hypothetical scenario, right, we don't exactly know what the correspondence is between this black box and the real language. And so whatever hypotheses we want to form, we're eventually going to need to validate by, trying to talk to the aliens if the aliens ever come back. But this is a really useful starting point.
So this box,
yes,
the same input gives you the same output?
Maybe it's stochastic, right? Maybe I put in one input and I get a distribution of their outputs.
Okay.
When you said that distributes like the data you saw previously, you mean for a random input?
Yeah, sure, in expectation, right? I mean, so hopefully where it's clear that this is going, right, is that in a certain sense, right, the kinds of language models that we can train right now behave like our alien black box in this sense, right? We can plug some strings into them, we can get some strings out, we can ask questions about strings that never appear in the training data. There seems to be some kind of systematic relationship between the inputs and the outputs that looks a lot like the relationship between the sentences that humans produce when you ask them specific questions or give them specific prompts, but in a way that might actually be a little bit difficult to characterize. Right, so just to put this another way, rather than training these black boxes on alien languages, what we can do is train these black boxes on the entire internet, and then we can plug strings in English or other human languages into them and get strings in English or other human languages. And so what this talk is going to be about broadly is sort of what we might do with a black box of this kind, and what kinds of, especially scientific questions, both about sort of human language processing and whale language, we can use with kind of language models broadly understood as a generic technology for for building models of communication systems. So I'm going to talk very briefly about one little vignette from our group that has nothing at all to do with animal communication and is actually about sort of understanding brain recordings. And then Pratyusha is going to talk about sort of language model black boxes for understanding how whales interact.
One quick question on this. If we're talking the kind of language models I'm used to, they don't generate strings, they generate probability distributions, and then there's still a sampling procedure, which is highly, highly influential. How does that play into this?
Yeah, well, I mean, so there are tricks that people play with the sampling procedure to get out better text, right? But if we sort of forget about that, there is a fundamentally what a language model is a conditional distribution over next tokens or a conditional distribution of strings, right? So if we want to think about it in that way, right, without any of the extra tricks that people do for sampling, particularly coherent generation, just think of these as conditional distribution. And that's actually going to be important for something that we're going to look at. Other questions? Cool. So to sort of motivate how we're going to use the black box, the alien black box, to answer questions about the structure of communication systems, right? A sort of brief review for maybe the non-computer scientists in the audience of what these language models we're talking about are. I'll go through this relatively frequently since I think some of this has been covered by other talks in this session. But fundamentally, what a language model is a next word prediction model, right? Just like the one that sort of sits on your phone and tries to guess what word is going to come next as you're writing a text message. So we plug some text in and we get out maybe the most probable next word, or in fact, maybe a distribution over words that might come next, tagged with the probability that those words come next. And these probabilities are derived from big text data sets where in particular contexts, certain words are more or less likely to follow. Good. Under the hood, these are, for the most part, neural nets using a specific architecture called the transformer, which you can think of as basically every word builds some sort of representation of itself by looking at all of the words that came before it in a sentence. And eventually we look at the last representation of the last word, and we decode that into a distribution over next words. We can build things that look like language models for sequences that are not corresponding to natural language strings, but data and other modalities as well. We saw this in Brian's talk yesterday, where we could decode into images or audio as well. So how might you use one of these models, right? A model that sort of takes some strings as input and generates some strings or some images or some audio as output to understand the structure of a communication system. Well, one thing that you might want to do is sort of peer deep inside this model and actually understand what computations it is performing in order to get from its inputs to its output, and learn something about the structure of the communication system from the actual internal structure.
Wait, you said you have a black box.
Yeah. So if we didn't have a black box, what would you do? Right. And the best you could hope to do is to sort of look inside the model, look at the weights and figure things out. There have been some successes from these kinds of approaches. Maybe the most sort of prominent one, there was a paper from DeepMind a couple of years ago where they trained a model to solve some sort of knot theory problem and then looked at the internal representations and learned some new invariants for knot theory. I think Gashper is also going to be talking about exactly this kind of approach for whale communication later today. But to Shafi's point, the question that I want to ask is, what can we do if we don't want to look at all inside the model? And one thing that we can do is at least learn a little bit about the kinds of features of inputs that are actually relevant for controlling certain pieces of outputs, right? So here's some alien string. We don't know exactly what the string means. We don't know what the pieces are. We don't know what the alien language is. But we know that when we plug it into our model, we get a picture of a monstrous insect. What happens if we shuffle some words around in this input string? Well, maybe we do our shuffling around, we plug this into our black box, and the same image pops out. And if we do this systematically, right, if we can do this over and over again, we can always shuffle our words around and find that that doesn't actually change the string that we get out. We've learned something about the structure of this language, right? Namely, that the order of these tokens probably doesn't actually matter that much for decoding. And conversely, if we shuffle some words around and we do get a different picture out, then what we've learned is probably that the word order does matter and does actually control in some way the meaning of this utterance, or at least the sort of relationship between these input strings and the outputs that they induce. And so this gives us a kind of general purpose toolkit for asking questions about what features of a communication system or of a representation system actually matter. And that's something like the following. We'll go out and we'll get a data set of input-output pairs. We'll train some kind of model, or we'll take our black box model that we have lying around and use it to sort of predict our outputs from our inputs. And then we'll do the same thing with a different model where we've systematically removed some piece of information from these inputs, right? Maybe that's by deleting tokens, maybe that's by shuffling them around, maybe that's by doing finer grained interventions into the system. We will, for reasons that I'm not going to talk about today, probably want to train a second model on the data that's been damaged in this way rather than reusing our first model from scratch. And then we'll just compare the difference in accuracy between these two models when we evaluate it on our original unmodified data set. And the sort of bigger the difference in accuracy that you get between these two models, the more consequential the feature that you removed was for the category of predictions that you care about making. There's a nice kind of general information theoretic framing of all of this that I'm not going to talk about today, that what we're actually computing is a quantity called the usable information that the feature F contains about this output distribution. Given whatever information was left behind in the inputs. Cool, and so there's been a bunch of work, mostly in the NLP literature, using this basic procedure of sort of taking an input, removing some information from it, retraining a model on it, and seeing how much worse that model gets as a way of understanding sort of both what it is that our models are actually learning in these kinds of natural language processing tasks, and for characterizing other features of data sets. And so what we're going to be looking at today is how to sort of go beyond NLP and use this to answer scientific questions as well. The first little vignette that I want to give is actually using this to understand something about how, as we'll get to in the moment, either how language is represented in the brain or how brain recordings work. The leads on this work were Karina and Greta, and this was in conjunction with Ev Fedorenko's lab and some other folks at MIT. Cool. So the sort of task that we're going to be looking at here is the problem of brain decoding. And this is something that there's been a lot of interest in, especially in recent years, especially with the sort of increased success of machine learning models. And so we have now pretty good neural nets that can either go from natural language inputs and try to predict what regions of the brain are going to be active, using various kinds of imaging technologies from those natural language inputs, or going in the opposite direction, starting with these kinds of recordings and decoding whatever stimulus a person was listening to or reading or thinking about from those. This works less well, but we're at least like starting to be able to do it. And so, this is something that a lot of people have worked on. We have models now that go in both of these directions and are sort of remarkably successful. And the question is, what is it that's actually being communicated by these signals that we are decoding, right? What is the information in these strings that's actually predictive of patterns of activity? And to the extent that we can't quite yet go from patterns of brain activity to like people's exact, the sentences that they were listening to or whatever, what kind of information might be missing from these signals?
Yeah. The same in these two sentences.
Sorry?
The sentences, the sentiment is the same.
Yeah, so this specific example was actually taken from this Tang et al. Paper from Alex Huth's group at UT Austin. And this is sort of the state of the art in decoding right now, where you can get from an input, you show somebody this sentence, we just record this, the neuroscientists just record this using actually fMRI, and this is kind of the best output that you can get. Some of the words are the same.
So I read about this in the New York Times.
Yeah.
But there was two possible conclusions, right? Conclusion one is that as long as you're talking about roughly the same thing,
yeah,
there's the same brain activity.
Yeah.
Conclusion two, that it's because of how good the neural net is, that its ability to decode backward, it's roughly, well, but not perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's conclusion two, probably.
Probably, yeah, but hang on.
So that's less exciting, unfortunately. Okay.
But we'll come back to that. Right. So this is sort of exactly the question. I guess at a higher level, is this an issue with the sort of class of models that we're using to do this decoding? Is it maybe an issue with the recording technology itself, that there's information that's being left behind? And so we can use exactly the procedure that we were describing before to at least start to answer these kinds of questions, right? We can take, and here we're going to be looking at encoding models rather than decoding models, but sort of models trained to go from strings to patterns of activity and figure out what features of those strings are actually necessary to get good alignment between our predictions and the brain. And so again, right, we might want to sort of remove systematically various kinds of information from our inputs here and see what effects those have on outputs. And if we delete these things and they don't change, then they're probably not actually necessary to do well at this prediction task. If we delete these things and they do change, then they're important. So here's an example using a particular category of these kinds of feature ablations. So here we're starting with an intact sentence: beekeeping encourages the conservation of local habitats. And when you do this, you get pretty good predictivity of brain activity like we're seeing over here. As a sort of control here, if we give a random list of words that's matched for length to this input, we don't get zero predictivity. So there's a little bit of signal just in the length of the sentence that you're giving and nothing else, but obviously a significant difference between these things. And we're now going to start to remove information, in this case, about word order gradually from this input. So we might swap just 2 words in the sentence. Remember that we're still trying to predict the brain activity in response to the intact sentence, but what we feed our learned model is one that's been swapped instead. And predictivity decreases a little bit, but not that much. Yeah.
So what's like a 0.1 difference on the y-axis?
Like qualitatively, what does that correspond to? So there's, think of it roughly as correlation between our predicted sort of pattern of activity across voxels, like a rank correlation between our predicted pattern of activity in voxels and the actual pattern of activity in voxels. It's a little bit more complicated than that in the sense that this has been like a ceiling has been applied to this for how much you could sort of potentially recover from the signal in an absolute sense. So it's like a normalized version of the correlation, but approximately that correlation. Yeah. Yes.
So you looked at the level of words. There are these, these kind of experiments where you can take a sentence and you change letters within the same word. You still read it in the same way. So basically there is some kind of error correction in the brain. Has these been tried?
Well, so as a reminder, like we're only ever trying to predict people's responses to intact sentences. So we're never going to show people stimuli that have been damaged in any way. You could do that. There's actually using one of the same data sets that we're doing here, did do some of those experiments, and people, not with sort of word internal shuffling, but word external shuffling. Actually, let me finish the slide and then I can say more about that because it is kind of an interesting topic. Okay, so maybe the more interesting thing that happens is if we start to do more aggressive damage to our input sentence and continue feeding it to this model, things get worse, but they don't, past a certain point, actually get that much worse. Once you start swapping more and more words, we can be even more aggressive here, right? We can reverse the order of the sentence. We can deliberately shuffle the words in the sentence in a way that like minimizes the mutual information between words that are adjacent to each other so that locally the sentence looks kind of as incoherent as possible. And really like none of these are distinguishable from each other. And so back to Michael's point, if you do, and this is not work that I was involved in, but if you do this experiment with people, you don't see this trend. You actually see instead like a steady fall off as you, or rather you see a significant, you see a significant difference between this low PMI condition and all of these other swaps that are meant to preserve PMI. Sorry?
Doing the experiment with people, you mean people's understanding?
Yeah. Yes.
You're using a transformer for this?
So here, the actual brain decoding model is GPT something. I don't actually remember exactly what off the top of my head, and then a linear layer on top of the sentence.
Okay, so then the next question is, were you using absolute or relative positional encoding for your transformer? Because this could be an effect of the positional encoding approach you use.
It's whatever is the default thing in GPT-2. I can't actually remember off the top of my head. Yeah. Okay. Cool, but so a takeaway here is that removing this ordering information doesn't actually substantially decrease our decoding accuracy. Yeah.
Sorry, a small detailed question. I didn't exactly understand your answer. So is this like if you show people this non-intact sentence, like their brain activity is very different from show them the intact? Or
So here we're just looking at
Okay.
recordings from intact stimuli. There's another paper from Ev's group that I can send people that looks at actually showing people the non-intact stimuli. But the important thing is that it's not the same trend as we observe here.
Yes.
Cool. We can do the same thing, removing now words from sentences rather than removing ordering information from sentences. And you see a similar kind of effect where really you can throw away most things other than like nouns and verbs and get similar kinds of effects. And so back to the question that Shafi was asking before, right? We've learned something about the kinds of features that are actually necessary to get good model to brain fit. And that in particular, those features don't seem to include ordering information and seem to mostly be about sort of like word meaning and word similarity. And then the big question is why, right? Does this reflect sort of a limitation of the information content of the recordings that we have themselves? Does it reflect the model that we're using to do the recording? Or is this just something about how language is represented in the particular region of the brain that we've been looking at here? And you know, so all like important questions for future work. But what this at least gives us, right, is a way of sort of pruning the hypothesis space and figuring out what kinds of things we ought to be looking at with regard to word order and word meaning and so on. And with that, I will hand things over to Pratyusha, who will talk about whales.
So in other words, if say we're talking about phone communication on the phones is always very fancy error correction. So if your error correction was so bad that it is not distinguish between these type of sentences, you can still recover on the other side.
Yeah, well, with the same degree of accuracy, right? Which is clear, like, obviously, word order matters for people who are doing language understanding. So somewhere at some level of representation, like the order information is getting processed in your mind.
Or you could put a neural net at the end to do whatever magic about it and then come up.
Sorry, I'm not sure.
So I'm thinking about this as an apparatus for error correction. So you start with one sentence, something happens in the middle of this. Obviously, that's not going to be the sort of thing that you try. But we're saying you change the orders, you erase words. I don't know what really remains after all this, but somehow you're able at the end to recover something that has a similar sentiment. So using the neural nets in the middle, it's a way that you're recovered. You're asking much more interesting scientific questions. What does this mean?
Yeah.
But it's also a way of recovering error.
Oh, right. So something that a separate thing that you can do, sort of independent of any of this brain stuff, and actually what we were doing in that O'Connor paper that I flashed earlier, is asking this question just about language itself, right? How many bits are in order that you need to do next sentence prediction? How many bits are in word identity for words of various kinds? Yeah, and you know, importantly, like especially in the long range context, order information really doesn't matter all that much. In general, although this varies from language to language, people are pretty good at recovering the meanings of sentences and sort of descrambling words in sentences that have been scrambled. Obviously, you're going to miss out on distinctions that matter in rare cases, right? Like if I give you man bites dog and I don't tell you whether those words were in the right order or not, you're going to conclude that the sentence was probably dog bites man, but that means that I'm never then going to be able to actually communicate the rare man bites dog event. Right, but you can use this toolkit also just to ask questions about language itself and not any sort of representation. Cool.
All right. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at how might some of these things be applied, maybe the same kind of tests be applied to understand. And before we get into how we're going to do it, let me introduce the sperm whale, which is the whale we're studying. So sperm whales are animals with the largest brains to have ever existed on the planet. And they've had it for 16 million years longer than us. And they live in these really complex matriarchal societies with multi-generational bonds. The members of the family, they dive together, they coordinate babysitting each other's young ones, and they also can coordinate in complete darkness. And while they coordinate in complete darkness, they exchange long sequences of sounds with one another. While many details about the sperm whale communication remains to be discovered, they're fruitful points of comparison between sperm whales and aspects of like a well-studied communication system, such as the human communication system. And inspired by the study by Hockett in 1960, this table highlights how different aspects of human language might have possible analogs in other communication systems, like really primitive animals to fairly complex animals, and how each of these different features of language might contribute to the animal's ability to in turn perform different kinds of behaviors. Today we're going to be looking at where does sperm whale communication really lie in this hierarchy. Does it exhibit discrete structure? Does it have hierarchical syntax, long-range dependencies? Is it productive? Or do sperm whales exhibit any kind of displacement? So you're not going to be looking at all of these questions today, but we'd probably focus on a few. Okay, so sperm whale sound something like this. So if clicks were to be represented by vertical dashes, they would look something like this. And these clicks are not randomly distributed in their calls, but they have more structure. And they pack into these groups that are oftentimes called codas. So the communication system of sperm whales is believed to be made up of distinct sequences of clicks called codas. And past research has identified a set of discrete coda types, and 21 discrete coda types in the Caribbean, to be precise. A subset of these coda types have been found to encode information about the speaker's identity, the clan's identity, but almost everything else about the sperm whale communication system, including questions about its structure and information carrying capacity, remain unknown. So the first thing we did was develop a bunch of visualization tools to better understand how might we even go about looking at these clicks, right? So instead of plotting these clicks horizontally like this, you're going to project them along the y-axis, such that every point represent, like the x position represents the time the click occurred at from the beginning of the file, and the y position represents the time at which the click occurred from the first click in the coda. And if we do this, and along with doing this, we're also going to scale up the y-axis so we can really look at the structure, the internal structure of the coda. And doing this for all the clicks is going to look something like this. So what I'm going to be saying now is going to sound very arbitrary, but yeah, please bear with me. So now let's say there's another speaker. We're going to do the same, and we're going to represent their clicks with a different color, right? And following that, just so we can keep track of how the codas evolve, we're going to connect clicks across codas made by the same whale with lines. We call this an exchange plot. So now if you look at 30 minutes of exchange between multiple whales, it starts to look something like this. And the exchange plot already highlights so much more structure and variability in the calls of the sperm whales that the clicks represented as dashes fail to show. If we were to zoom into one of these plots, you can see how whales produce codas with different tempos, like with analogy to some musical terminology. They have different kinds of rhythms. There's also these randomly scattered extra clicks. And they also gradually vary the total duration of their overall codas. But now going back to how Jacob analyzed brain recordings, now we want to really understand what aspects or what features of this communication system might actually be communicative, and possibly what function might they serve. But we're not going to be looking at the second one, we're only mostly just going to be looking at. I think so. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at, instead of brain decoding, we're going to start looking at how can we decode the communication system of whales, right? Where we make perturbations to the input and try to see how that might affect what the output might look like, right? And in our case, we're going to be looking at, we'll first train a model over whale vocalizations, similar to a language model, where we'll condition on both what were the calls that the whales made previously, along with the identity of the whales. So we have information about the speaker identity and what they said and when they said so. And following that, we'll predict what's going to be said, who's going to say it, and when might they say it. The features we're going to be looking that we're going to be looking at today include information about long range context, like how far behind in their conversation context do whales really depend on to produce the next sound that they're going to produce. And there are also other like specific features, such as like what if you interchange the word order, or like remove certain aspects of the features that I talked about in some of the slides before. How does that affect the quality of predictions? So on the left side is a plot showing how the ability of the model to predict the next coda or who's the speaker and so on changes with increasing context. Like most animals are believed to have attend only to shorter times in their history, and do not even attend to conversations maybe really long time ago. But this shows that to some degree, increasing the context window to maybe 5 previous calls lets the model predict what's going to happen next better. Another thing that you could study is really what is the complexity of the model that might fit this data distribution the best, right? And to do that, we train a few different types of models, starting with the N-gram model, then an RNN model, and then a neural network model, and an LSTM model. And we see that while an N-gram model can fit the data really well, training a more complex model allows predicting some of these longer range dependencies better. Another interesting thing is that if we drop out certain features of the whale's calls, it ends up being the case that such as the extra click, it ends up being the case that the ability of the model to predict changes in chorusing behavior decreases. And by chorusing behavior here, I mean that the next speaker might drop a turn, join a turn, or might end the conversation. So in some sense, aspects of their calls tie to decisions that they're making thereafter in the context of their communication.
What is with vocalizations and control? What are those? What are the control or?
Yeah, so the control is if you drop out, if you don't have any information of the, so I think control is just 50-50. So if I have,
Excuse me, what?
So for example, with the extra click, without the extra click.
Oh,
yeah.
When you manipulate these things that started as audio, do you discretize them and then feed in discretized stuff? Like tokenize? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So
rather than manipulate the audio to remove a click.
Yes, exactly. So we train these models on annotations that Shane has, which mark the beginnings of the click, and every coda is represented as a vector of ICIs.
So how do you decide what's a coda?
Yes, so I guess Shane could answer the question really well. Okay, so I guess the way you decide is that, so typically within 1 second, if there's no other click, then all the clicks that occurred before then and were made by the same whale are grouped as one coda.
Okay.
Yeah, and on average, if the same whale produces another coda, it's typically after 4 seconds of producing the first coda.
Yeah, moving words around. You mean taking the entire coda and moving it?
Yes.
And certainly one could, in this same paradigm, specifically preserve only the relative relations of clicks within a coda, not the overall duration of the coda or other sort of pieces of subcoda structure.
Separate groups and SETI are looking at parts of within a coda, or what we'd be traditionally calling a coda, and whether or not you recover the same information by having pieces of it being gone. So far, the definition of coda has been upheld.
So you said that there are 21 discrete coda types.
So, that classification is it? I can imagine a scenario whale time in which three of the same codas meant something within, I mean, maybe they're counting schools of fish. So the quantity could change the quality of the thing, like an individual versus like a group of something. So when you, do you count how many are in a series of codas and count the asterisks? Ones? Like if you have 4 and then you have 3 or something like that, and then another class coda, or you can move up the codas together and then that structure the number of codas. Great.
Yeah, great question. So like I was talking about here, so we don't really specifically have groups like how many codas the same time and so on. We train these models. These are trained like condition on the vector representation of the coda, but the context itself, like if there was information in how many such codas might result in being able to predict what's happening next, then maybe some internal features of the model might pick up on exactly like the ones you're describing.
Okay, so maybe forgive my ignorance of how you're training the model. So if it's like unsupervised, you let the computer find patterns and so on, right? But are you kind of doing like semi-supervised, or I don't know if the right technical definition is. It's insofar as you're giving the system directions to count for how many codes come together, something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're training these models identical to how Jacob described, like language models are trained, right? And you could think of it as self-supervised, like basically given a sentence, you can take different pieces of the sentence and train one to predict the next word. Like similarly, in these conversations, you can take different chunks of these conversations and train one to predict the next coda and the coda after that, and other features like when will the next coda, when will the next coda be made, and so on.
And sorry, just to add on to that, so like in the same way that when we do this with natural language, we find that models
Sort of internally recover information about the hierarchical structure of natural language, and Pratyusha actually has some unrelated work on doing that in models of natural language. You could imagine that if clusters are relevant or numbers are relevant or whatever else, then that'll eventually get picked up by
The model.
Well, is there a reason why you need the dialogue opposed to one? Well, the characters, and you make predictions with just one. Well,
Yeah, that's a great question. So like I think both of those questions, like I think both the questions are important, and we indeed have models that are just trained on the single whale scores. And I think they tell you different things, right? Like if I say my name is, and I say my name, but like in a dialogue, it's possible, like as you might have the two aspects. One, a dialogue will tell you about not just how single speaker sentences are produced, but it'll also tell you about other aspects of discourse, like when are terms changing, what kinds of responses are likely to be made after someone says a particular thing, and so on. Right, so that's one. But another interesting thing is, unlike how humans, like we mostly wait for another person to finish speaking before we speak, whales do not. It's not the case exactly in whales. Like they end up interrupting over one another. So the notion of a sentence or a full, like a complete sentence is not very clear in the case of whales. But yes, I think both of these questions like can help you answer it. So the other thing we saw was, so earlier we were just talking about being able to predict the next call, but in fact, you could condition on different amounts of conversational context and predict aspects of behaviors of these whales, such as when the whale might dive given a conversation. And what we see is, like while we might not be able to say exactly what the whale is saying before they dive, conditioning on like enough of a context window, you can kind of also predict when the whale might dive. Also, we're trying to be intentionally vague because some of these papers are under review and we cannot talk about some. All right, so I guess what we saw was calls contain some information about the context and future behavior. And while these models might not be perfect, you can still do these do these ablations to check how changing specific features of the input affect your output and might tell you something about the original data distribution. And in this case, I think this tool is especially useful because ultimately we do not have a speaker in both the languages. And this is kind of our only way to comment about the data distribution and designing specific features. So in conclusion, yeah, so black box neural models make it possible to quantify what parts and what features of a signal might carry information. And the way to do that is by either dropping them out, modifying them, and looking at how it changes, how the model responds to some of these changes. So this gives us a very powerful jumping off point for exploratory data analysis and hypothesis formulation. We've also used it to identify information absent from brain recordings and ones that are present in sperm whale communication systems.
Sad question.
Thank you.
This will probably make sense only to the people who are inside it. So the dive information is the PHR or PRH MATLAB files. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
And I just want to make sure I'm getting like the high level here. So I train a model on transcribed sequences of codas. The context needs to be, now I wasn't sure what it said 5K, is that 5,000 prior codas?
I think the K was just the variable representing the
okay.
context, yeah.
So 5 prior codas?
Yeah.
So I have 5 prior codas. I've trained a GPT model. That's my attention window. And then I look at predicting the next out of a set of 21 possible codas. 26? Okay, and then I predict.
Which, it's important to say, as Shane was alluding to, that like the precise number categorization scheme is a little up in the air,
yes.
But one thing you can actually do with this toolkit is exactly ask questions about, 2 different theories about what the actual coda inventory is. I can sort of adjudicate between them based on whether one or the other contains enough information to predict future vocalizations.
Okay.
Exactly. And I guess the plots here were with maybe 21 coda types. We also have experiments where we change this, like number of coda types to represent the codas differently, including the ICI vectors itself, and go and try to predict the vectors by themselves.
Okay.
And then look at like maybe what representation system results in like least drop in information and what needs to be predicted.
Okay, so I guess my last question here is, and this is kind of like a meta rhythm question. So I get that you identify codas by number and rhythm of the clicks within the group. Is that right?
The types, yeah.
So it's the rhythm. So the types are decided by the internal spacing of the clicks, which, like, if you were to, let's say, we make, I think this is Shane's example, but like if you do, right, versus you do a slower, might have the same rhythm. So rhythm typically is when you normalize the codas by the total duration, you can talk about the internal spacing of the clicks independent of the tempo. But the coda types are decided like jointly over both of these features.
Okay, so both tempo and rhythmic pattern within a coda. And so I'm just wondering, have you all looked at rhythmic pattern between codas, or do you turn them into just a sequence?
Rhythmic pattern between codas, so like across different codas, if there's any kind of arrangement of these codas itself, is that
well, I guess I was just wondering if there were patterns in the spacings, like, so now I've got my 21 codas, and I can have a larger rhythmic pattern over the spacing of the codas. And I was wondering if this is something you guys have encoded or are looking at.
Yeah, that's a great question. So like in this experiment, so the information that we condition on is the coda type, the time at which the coda was made, right? And who the speaker was, right? So the time, if you have both the coda type and the time at which the coda was made, just like the other question, if there is a rhythmic pattern across different codas, that might get picked up on. But I don't know if interpreting your question differently, a whale typically makes the next coda 4 seconds apart, like on average, with just some variance. So we do not really pick up on any such structure across codas, but yeah, that is.
Can you say something about the size of your data set? And as far as I know, it's not huge, right? And of course, you're hoping to get a lot more data, and how you think that this will improve the accuracy of the model.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I think we were talking about this a little bit yesterday. So the data set we're looking at currently is the Dominica's Sperm Whale project data set that Shane and his team collected. And we're looking specifically at the EC1 clan, which is a particular clan of sperm whales in the Caribbean. And the total number of codas is about 3,840, right? So that's not many codas, but while we cannot train really big models on such a small data set because they'll overfit really quickly, we train really small models. And while these models are limited in terms of their expressivity as compared to maybe larger models, you can still ask these questions with a model that's better than random, right? So yeah, and to the second part of your question, with more data, we can train more expressive models, right? And they're like, with the quality of predictions that the model makes will improve, but you can still ask the same questions. And yeah, so with more data, the quality of the model will improve. Like, you're basically see a lower prediction error, hopefully, if there really are features that the smaller models are not picking up on.
I had a quick question. Are we done? Oh, hi. Thanks for a great talk, first of all. So I just wonder, maybe I missed something. So maybe I can ask you also, Shane, how many codas you have? How many codas, and are they each coda? Is there a coda per animal that you've identified, or that?
Yeah. So right now in any of this analysis, we're not using coda per animal, right? Because it's just sequences made by different animals, and the identities are always like, coded as integers. So the first speaker, second speaker, third speaker, rather than whale named X, whale named Y. So all this analysis does not really rely on specific identities of individuals, but yes, there is that breakdown of which codas were made by which speakers, at least for the whales that were tagged.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. I wasn't sure.
That like this uses the most hand annotated subset. So like these 4,000 codas is the part where we've had grad students doing the hand annotation for a number of years, and then there's another larger data set where we're making big advances on like automating the annotation, which comes into sort of what France was talking about yesterday about applying new methods to augment the data set, because for every minute it takes 8 to 12 minutes to have someone sit there. I'm sure all your computer science are familiar with that kind of thing. But yes, like prior to SETI and reinforced in SETI, there are codas where we can recognize different levels of social structure, but that's independent from the sequencing and the work that Pratyusha is presenting.
Thank you for clarifying. Thanks.
Yeah, we need 2 microphones, I think.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Jacob about the idea of altering the input to measure what changes in the output. And maybe something I missed before, but these models, these black boxes, usually are non-deterministic. So like DALL-E, you have diffusion, you have different seeds, also language models. You do you sample from a probability distribution. So how can you be sure that the alteration is from the inputs and not from the non-deterministic nature of the model?
Yeah, well, so I guess it's not really the case that a language model is non-deterministic, right? A language model represents a conditional probability distribution. You can choose to sample from that distribution, or you can just ask what the probability is of some fixed target string given some fixed input string. And that probability is going to be the same every time you query the model. And so that's all we're doing here, right? That sort of in practice, what we're looking at is like the log of the conditional probability of some ground truth target sequence that came next, given a version of the input from which information was removed or not removed.
from my.
Sure. Thanks for a really great talk, both of you. I had a question for Pratyusha. I was wondering, so I guess first I was wondering, with these models, are you just trying to predict the next coda in a sequence, or are you also trying to predict the context, like the behavior of the whales as a function of the sequence of codas?
Yes. Okay, so that's a great question. So we're doing both. And in fact, like this experiment, like this one, was trying to predict the behavior, right? And one other thing which I did not mention is that we're not just predicting the next coda, but we're trying to predict the next few codas, because sometimes the next coda itself sees very little change, like, and on average, if the model just fits to the original data distribution, it'll just predict the exact same coda. But some of these models also predict longer like sequence lengths, so you can actually see some. So the model is receives a penalty if it does not predict like the next n codas correctly, and so on. But yes, both the types of the code, the types of the codas, when the codas are made, because that is also an important feature in these in sperm whale discourse, where whales can interrupt each other and so on. When there might be a change in speaker, and like aspects of behavior that we know about.
So I had a follow-up question to that. This is more speculative, but I was kind of wondering, do you have any idea if it would be possible to apply this type of technique to a system where you don't necessarily know what the units are? So you have like discrete codas that you can identify and tokenize. But what if you had a system where you don't know what the units are, you don't know how many units there are, you don't even know if there are discrete units? Is there some way that you can kind of apply this process of ablation to test for the possibility that there are units and then identify them?
Yeah, no, that's also a really nice question. So I think that connects a bit back to Brian's talk from yesterday, like where instead of training on known tokens or like a guess of possible tokens, you can train on the audio file itself, right? And the other thing you could do is, so that is if you want to work directly from raw data, right? But another thing that you could alternatively test, which I guess connects back to one of the questions somebody else asked, is if you have a guess over possible sets of tokens, right? And then you could train different models over all possible sets of tokens, right? And you could see which tokenization scheme results in like loss and predictability over fixed representation of the output, right? And that might tell you which tokenization scheme might even be better, right? Like if I represent all codas with just a single token, right, versus I represent them with, let's say, 5 tokens, which might be more informative, then really conditioning on just a fixed token doesn't tell you too much about what might happen next, right? But if you were to represent them by 5 different tokens, you have more information to condition on, and as a result, you could use these methods to also decide on what might be the right tokenization scheme.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Is what, just to follow up to what you said, your question. So would that be accurate to describe it as injecting simulated codas, or is that kind of a different technique?
Injecting, yeah. So I don't think I understand what injecting simulation.
Like you make up a coda and then you inject it into you simulate codas and then you inject them into the model and then you apply that trained model to real signals. Like do you harness simulations in order to improve your actual study of?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. I'm not sure I understand, Jacob.
Yeah, I mean, we're not really doing that here. I guess one way of thinking about that you can do. Right. So right now, when we talk about removing information from these inputs, it's mostly like literally we're just either hiding some piece of information about the input coda or truncating the input. So hiding information about the past. Another way that you could accomplish the same goal that would sort of have the same effect of removing information would be to train this model not on data sets from which codas have just been removed or coda features have been removed, but instead into which noise has been injected, right?
Right.
Shuffling things around. Randomly injecting extra space in between clicks in a coda or whatever. And I think you expect those kinds of interventions to have the same effect as what we're doing here, but that's not explicitly what we're doing.
Okay, got it. That's super helpful. Okay, my original question was, I learned from David, I think, that these clicks are one of 4 kind of vocalizations in sperm whales repertoire. Is that right? Am I getting that number right? So this might be like future testing, but are you thinking about analyzing the different kinds of vocalizations together with the clicks? So like click, 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 bee, like click, 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 bee, and then I like dive to like go get fish. Are you looking at or I imagine, and this gets back to Diana's question, that like the kinds of clicks that a mother sends her calf are really different than the like bonded pair. So I know that you haven't gotten so far as identifying the whales, but like I'm just really curious to know how you're going to integrate this data into the future of understanding social relationships and predicting future behavior through vocalizations that are beyond the clicks.
Yeah, great question. So I guess so one thing, as Shane mentioned, the current studies are on this heavily annotated data set where only the codas are annotated. But yes, in principle, you could like either train on the complete audio if we have enough data, right? Or like if you have a guess of how some of these, like once you know what these sounds are and have them annotated, condition on also those sounds represented as some tokens. Right? And like how, so we've asked questions mostly about dive behavior and not that much about social relations. But yes, in principle, you could use this very same model to predict a different kind of output, such as social relations.
I would also just add that codas are like a significant majority of utterances. So the trumpets and like these coda creaks and so on are rare occurrences in the vast majority of conversations. When they get hypersocial and the whole family comes together and there's 7 or 8 animals and they go crazy for 45 minutes, then it approaches things that you might compare to like the bottlenose dolphins, where there's lots of sounds going on all at the same time. But the codas make up a huge proportion of the sounds they make, and they're highly temporally structured. So like and I'm happy to, we're all happy to show, and we can all listen to codas, that the reason that we came up with this being a discrete unit is that it's 4 seconds apart from the thing that it previously said, meaning that specific individual. So that's where the thing began. It's a lot less complicated than signature. Oh, she's gone. Then signature whistles, where the question became, well, where does the whistle start and end? This has at least as an outside observer, an obvious place to start. And so far, all of the distance within coda or between coda sort of supports that as an idea. So, but you're right, there's lots of complexity to add. And that's where SETI's spending a lot of time on automatic detection of all of these different types to do the annotation, rather than having hordes of graduate students spend a huge amount of time.
Yeah, great talk. Thank you. Did you guys mention a toolkit, or were there 2 toolkits? Did somebody mention a toolkit? No, I thought I heard the word toolkit. Okay. So there's no,
I mean, in the like abstract sense, but not in the sense of the Python package.
We made the talk about the brain, and then there were about the whales. And similarities that I see is this, the method of blocking out stuff, But the part about the brain where you had like the sentences to images and then images to sentences, where these sentences had similar in terms of sentiment and so forth. You're imagining something like that down the line, because I can't see where right now it's too poor, right, to do these kind of fancy things. I mean,
sorry, you mean on like doing fMRIs to whales?
No, not fMRIs. Forget about that. I wasn't thinking of that. I mean, any kind of backwards and forwards. So you're going forward all the time. But I'm curious, what would be the kind of backward analog,
Yeah, I mean, I guess one sort of meaningful distinction between the 2 halves is that when we're talking about this sort of brain encoding, fundamentally there's 2 modalities, right? The sort of Y's are images and the X's are sentences. In the experiments that Pratyusha was talking about, there's only one modality. We're trying to, I guess that's not entirely true, right? There's the, sort of trying to predict future vocalizations from present vocalizations, and then all the other social, behavioral, whatever context. And certainly then you could imagine training a model that goes in the opposite direction, right? Going from trying to predict, given that I'm in state X, what are the kinds of vocalizations I'm likely to observe?
And also the amount of data you have right now, you cannot really get a generative model, can you?
I mean, it's a generative.
It is a
model.
generative
It's not
model.
A very good generative model, but
Not
it's
good.
enough to score things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's fundamentally it's kind of hard for us to assess how good the generative model is because you can't look at the output and say, oh, that seems grammatical.
Right. So we have no playback possibility yet or reaction.
Yeah, right. So I mean, the thing that one could do would be a playback experiment, right? Take this language model and let it play one side of a dialogue. And right now, I think we don't. That's like you can do that, and that's an experiment that you could run. It's not clear what the actual scientific question is there, unless there's a specific.
Certainly, you'd have the forward and backwards thing.
Yeah, no, but even then, I think where we imagine this being most useful is right. We say at some future point we identify some feature that we think means okay, this specific behavior needs to come next, or I'm talking about this whale, it's not present right here, or whatever. Then the playback experiment that you do is to have one version of this model that can produce the message that you think is meaningful and one version of the model that cannot produce the message that you think is meaningful, and compare the behaviors that result from whales having conversations with those two different models. And I think we're like not even at the point of having identified anything that concrete, but that's what that looks like. And then it's an interesting separate question of whether, like, to what extent you need conversation and need the ability to like respond in real time. And in the limit of having unlimited data, you could train this model, you could put it in the water with the whales. Suppose we deal with all kinds of other issues associated with them actually getting, believing that this recording system that we've stuck in the water is actually a whale that they can talk to. That conversation will then happen. It'll have the same distribution as the conversations that the whales themselves say. That doesn't necessarily imply that we understand anything.
No, of course,
about what's being communicated.
One last question. So you did distinguish between the kind of conversations that are happening before you dive, before you go up, whatever. There were a few. The distinguishing is very clear. It's very separate type of Dakotas, or is it just distributionally there's some shift?
So that's the thing that we're still looking into right now. There's being able to predict, and then there's figuring out what features are actually the predicted features.
And the way to do that would again be just to modify, like in a controlled way, the different features, right? Like the rhythm, tempo, and so on. But also to answer that question, there are like differences across the different contexts that are visually clear, and also like in some cases there are like certain features that allow making the prediction better and better. Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Really exciting morning. Thanks to our morning speakers, Roberto, Jacob, Pratyusha. We'll take 30 minutes and reconvene.
Yeah.